Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to News in Focus. My name is Fahraaz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. For the next 1 hour, I have a very special guest all the way from the United Kingdom. Yesterday, on a talking point, we had Muazzam Beg, and we're keeping to the theme of having our brothers from the UK. Joining me now, he is no stranger to the journalism sphere. Of course, you see him on a lot of interviews. You see him doing a lot of interviews himself. Of course, he's the deputy editor of Pillars. It is an organization based within the United Kingdom, and he's fresh out of interviewing Errol Musk. Are we going to touch on that in a bit? It's none other than Dilly Hussein. Dilly, assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah so much for gracing us here with your presence.
No, Jazakallah khair for having me. Walaikum salam. The only apologies I have to make is I'm not dressed for the occasion.
It's fine.
But
It's okay.
I hope the depth of the conversation surpasses my casual wear.
No. I think that's all that we need right now from you, just the depth of the conversation, Brother Dilly. How's the media, the non-mainstream media occurring in the United Kingdom? And there's so much that we're going to discuss, because obviously we've seen the rise of the digital technology age really taking forth. And of course you have podcasts which you host on a regular basis. That alternative voice within the United Kingdom, how is it changing the sphere of media in that part of the world?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. We are indeed living at a time where the mainstream media, the corporate media, is now facing fierce competition from alternative media, whether that's alternative media which is grounded on faith-based news or alternatively ideological news. But there seems to be a widespread, counter wave of alternative media. Even the story of 5 Pillars, and my own personal career in journalism, myself and the co-founder Rasha Muhammad Saleh, we made a conscientious decision that we could have easily pursued a career in the mainstream. Sure. And I did a internship in the Daily Mirror. I worked at my local newspaper. I could have easily pursued the normal trajectory that most journalists do. However, as a result of the tight censorship, political censorship within the mainstream media, when you go against certain editorial lines, whether it be British foreign policy, Western foreign policy, the state of Israel, whatever it may be, all of a sudden you realize that there is space for you to rise up the ranks so long as you either self-censor or you compromise.
Sure.
And this is something that me personally and Rasha Muhammad Saleh and many others actually, even non-Muslim commentators and pundits, they've realized we're just not willing to make those type of compromises. And what social media has done, it has provided alternative platforms whereby you can actually surpass the viewership of mainstream media outlets. That's why you find the likes of Joe Rogan podcast. You find that the likes of Piers Morgan, who I do not see as alternative media, by the way, but even he...
And you've engaged him quite a number of times.
Yes, I've had a few showdowns with him in the past, in 2019 over the LGBT issue, 2023 over the Gaza genocide. So what's happened now is that the alternative media space is growing. In some spaces it's competing. In some spaces it's surpassed the numbers, the viewers, the clicks, the engagements, the comments, and the exposure to the mainstream media. And I think that's healthy, and I think that's needed. I think it's absolutely necessary. However, there are some cons. There are some blind spots that we need to be mindful of. As alternative media is growing, the authenticity of news has taken a hit.
Sure.
So anyone with a platform and a mic and a camera can open up a channel, say crazy things, and they'll get loads of views.
Of course,
We still have to stick to the principles of journalism, which is you verify news, you authenticate news, you authenticate and verify sources and so forth. All of this is very important. So I believe that alternative media spaces should be supported. They should be delved into, so long as the principles of news and journalism is maintained and upheld.
Here's the thing, Dilly. Since September 11th, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, the Arab Spring, and now, of course, with the Gaza genocide, what I've noticed, and especially with United Kingdom media, people are starting to lose trust in them because the wording that they are using, the lack of coverage that they're using. Just this week, a pediatrician had lost 15 or 11 of her children.
Nine
of her
of
children.
children, yeah.
and the BBC said nothing about it. People are going to start to look through the glass ceiling and say, we can't trust this media because they're not reporting facts, whereas two Jewish citizens in the United States or two Jewish representatives in the United States were killed, and that's given an hour, 2 hours of airtime. People are starting to see through it, aren't they?
Absolutely. I want to cite a very unique piece of research just to give you an insight of how bad the situation is. It's quite a profound piece of academic research, and I would implore with all your viewers to look into it. Professor Paul Baker from the University of Lancaster, he carried out a piece of research back in 2003 entitled Representation of Islam in the British Press. He studied, analytically, forensically studied 200,000 news articles.
Sure.
That's a lot of data.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And he concluded, after carrying out this vast research, that for every one positive article about Islam and Muslims, there were 21 negative articles about Islam and Muslims. He found that words such as extremism, fundamentalist, Islamist, terrorism, these words had become synonymous with the representation of Islam and Muslims in the British press. And the one positive article, so he studied the 200,000 articles, and the ratio was like 1 to 21. But even when there was positive coverage of Muslims, there'd be an omission of Islam and Muslims. But whenever there's a negative coverage, there's always a mention of Islam and Muslims. A similar research was carried out by the University of Georgia and Alabama, where they basically concluded that Muslim perpetrated political violence received 357% more coverage than white political violence, when white political violence in the United States was far more than Muslim acts of political violence. Yet the Muslim crimes received 357% more. This huge disparity is not coincidence. It's by design. It's by choice. It's decisions that editors are making in the language that they use, in what they choose to omit. Palestinians somehow die, but they never mention the killers. But an Israeli IDF soldier who's 18 or 19 is a teenager. So this type of language where you humanize the oppressor and the occupier and the wrongdoer, but you dehumanize the victims, is something that's become so normal within the Western corporate media, whether it be print or in broadcast.
You interviewed Errol Musk.
Yes.
Right. The reason why, it's because he's not really given much South African media the attention. So obviously one would assume that, coming from the United Kingdom, Telly, he would obviously give it. No, I know you've been in discussions with him.
Yeah.
Is he the son's father?
You can certainly conclude that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Sure.
I reached out to Errol Musk just before Ramadan. We were in communication. He was open to the idea of engaging. Obviously, he's aware that Five Pillars has a very significant following online. Sure. And the interview was supposed to actually happen before Ramadan, but because we were very busy, we thought we'll do it after Ramadan. So I went to Langaban to meet him.
West Coast.
Yeah, the West Coast, yes. So I met him 2 days ago at time of filming. And to begin with, he was very welcoming. He allowed us to use his home and set up and pray and all of that kind of stuff. Very, very
he allowed
warm.
You to make salah? Okay.
Yes. We prayed salah, and he was a good host. He was very welcoming. And it was like a 2-hour conversation.
Okay.
Right. And I spoke about his life, his family, his parents, his background, his family heritage, what he was up to during the period of apartheid. I don't want to give any kind of what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to give any kind of teasers.
You're right, sure.
But
they have to just watch it.
Yeah, they have to watch it. But I'll give you a few insights.
Right.
It's interesting that he claimed that he was a part of the anti-apartheid party. I forgot which party it was in Pretoria. Okay. Yet his views
I think it's the Democratic Party.
The Democratic Freedom Party.
Yeah.
Yet towards the end of the podcast, he came out with some very troubling views. Views which absolutely contradicted what he began the podcast with. He, for some reason, he believes that black people cannot create functioning societies.
Right.
He believes that black people work best under white supervision. And that's all I'm going to say for now. He says a lot more. So is he the father of Elon Musk? For sure. You can certainly tell that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And he's someone who, obviously he's 79. I don't know if senility could be applied to him, Allahu Alam. But the actual engagement was courteous. It was respectful, but for sure some of his views were very troubling and distasteful.
Well, before we go to the break, of course, he has the, in order for Starlink to come here, he's asked the South African government to change its triple BE policies, and I'm sure you know about triple BE. So interesting how that's going to go ahead and carry itself. But after the break, I continue my conversation with Dilly Hussein. We're going to be talking about the Gaza genocide and how the last 1.5 years has changed not only the narrative across the world, but especially that in the media. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm still in conversation with Dilly Hussein, who is the deputy editor at 5 Pillars. Dilly, pre-October the 7th, I think it needed an educated person to understand the occupation, the Zionist occupation of Palestine since 1948. When you fast forward to that day and post October the 7th, 2023, it's quite clear, isn't it, that the worldwide view of Israel has started to change in a way that not only are they seeing themselves isolated, but that villain tag that they have is starting to expose itself. You've been engaging with so many individuals when it's spoken about with regards to the Gaza genocide. Let's start off from the political perspective. How important is this narrative for it to change so that from a global point of view, people understand the true nature of who Israel are?
I think the global perception of Israel as the only beacon of democracy in the Middle East is completely shattered. And that's for those who are under any illusion that it was that in the first place. The events of the Gaza genocide did not start on October the 7th. It did not start with the Camp David Accords or the Oslo Accords. It did not start with the 1973 war. It did not start with the 1967 Six-Day War. It did not even start with Al-Nakba. It started way before that. It did not even start with the 1917 Balfour Declaration. It started in the late 1800s with the formation of the World Zionist Organization led by Theodor Herzl and other founding fathers of the Zionist movement, who were hell-bent, and of course the Rothschild family, who were hell-bent on forming a land for the Jewish people in Palestine, the Holy Land, which is sacred to the 3 Abrahamic faiths. And there was intense lobbying, there was intense financial dealings, political pressure that led to the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Now, we've not even got to the Holocaust yet. And it's important that the viewers understand this history before we understand the events of October the 7th, because not enough people talk about it. You'll find that people say, oh, Oslo, Camp David, 73, 67, Al-Nakba. No, it started before that. The preparations, the demographic shifting of moving hundreds and thousands of European Jews over to Palestine, arming them under the British watch, stealing their lands, taking the arms from the Palestinian Arab farmers. This was all set up for what we saw in 1948 known as Al-Nakba and the establishment of the Zionist entity. For the last 70 to 80 years, the Muslim world, the global South, and South Africa, of course, we don't need convincing of what Israel is and what the ideology of Zionism purports. We don't need convincing, but the West needed it. And I believe the last 19 months, the horrific levels of violence, the genocidal, dystopian, Armageddon type of violence has truly woken the eyes and hearts of millions upon millions of white Westerners who would have traditionally been sympathetic to Israel, or at the very least sat on the fence and been neutral. Recent polls, successive polls, have shown that public opinion has changed in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, whereby it's even and even now.
And those are strong allies of Israel.
Strong allies. These are like the heartlands of the Zionist support. The UK, the US, France, Germany, Canada, these are countries, Germany, these are countries that have historically and continue to do so, support Israel financially, militarily, and provide a diplomatic and political cover in the international stage. And this is changing now. And this is something which Israel and its allies are worried about. That's why we saw the debate around banning TikTok in the US. That's why we've seen many censorship policies that are now being introduced in Meta, X, which basically shows that those who continue to support Israel are worried. The global opinion about Israel and Zionism has not just changed somewhat, it has radically changed. We now need these change in public opinions to now translate into policy shifts. We've seen that recently with Canada and France and the UK, but I believe this is just rhetoric because, as we know, Nelson Mandela and the ANC were terrorists right up until 1994. All of a sudden, we've always supported the ANC. We've always supported 1994. Sure. Now we have a statue to commemorate Nelson Mandela in Parliament Square. But it was only up until the mid-90s that ANC and Mandela were still listed as a terrorist organisation under UK law. So we've seen the hypocrisy of Western governments in that when they realise the public opinion has shifted so much that some things just become indefensible. And that's why we've seen a rhetoric and a policy shift within the British government, France and Canada more recently, talking about sanctions, condemning Israel. But quite frankly, this is too little too late because these countries, especially my country of birth and residency, continues to arm, continues to send F-35 fighter jet parts, Elbit systems, BAE systems, still continue to produce the very weapons that are used to carry out the genocide that we're seeing.
And in the next segment, I want to focus especially on the United Kingdom and its ties with Israel, but I want to shift to media. Yourself, Five Pillars, Mehdi Hassan, Zetio, many other alternative media. You can see its editorial policy as opposed to that of CNN, Sky, the BBC. The Zionist lobby, how much of influence have they had on the editorial policy of these major media houses? I ask this because what we've seen in the last few days, the little aid that has been coming, Palestinians clinging onto it because this is all they have. That little girl whose tent was burnt, ashes, who's now running around. Children dying of hunger because famine is the hardest hit now in Gaza. And yet they refuse to cover it. And if they do cover it, it's a 1 minute, actually not even 1 minute, a 30-second story. Whereas October the 7th received 2 hours, 3 hours, live crossings here, live crossings there. The way that media is covering the Gaza genocide as opposed to something that happens when it's Israel who's under attack, whether it's missiles in Ben Gurion airport or whatever the case may be, it's stark, isn't it? And the hypocrisy and them being exposed is there for all to see, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that is why, even like the Mehdi Hassan and the formation of Zeteo. Now, Mehdi Hassan is someone who's enjoyed mainstream spaces.
Sure. I mean, he's been in the biggest in the USA.
Yes, exactly. MSNBC, he's enjoyed the biggest platforms. Now, if he's felt the need and the pressure to form an independent alternative media outlet, you can kind of understand how bad the situation is. Look, the likes of the mainstream corporate media, from your Murdoch outlets to, you know, all the established media outlets, they toe a particular line and they hide behind this pretense of impartiality, this pretense that Israel has a right to exist and defend itself, and that anything that goes against that is seen as anti-Semitic. Now, the Israeli lobby have been impressively impactful in the way that they have, over the course of years, dictated and heavily influenced the language which is used when reporting matters pertaining to Israel and Palestine. You'll find that, again, link back to the research which I cited earlier on, language like militancy, extremists, terrorism is all linked to the Palestinian Resistance and Liberation Organization, but things to do with democracy, humanity, freedoms, civilization is all linked to Israel and Zionism. And this is no coincidence. They literally have, I think it's an 82-page or 182-page a language discourse book which the Israeli lobby in all Western countries give to all these corporations, media corporations, and basically they literally copy and paste these lines from this playbook. And that's how deeply entrenched the Israeli lobby and the ideology of Zionism is within all these channels that we watch and have been watching for years, from your CNN, from your BBC, from your Sky News, from all the major channels. But I've not even gone into Fox News, the circus show that is Fox News, but they all have a particular playbook which they have to abide by. They may differ here and there on certain, whether you're centre left or centre right or right wing, yes, but they all told the same line, and that line is Israel has a right to exist. Israel has a right to self-defense. They are the only democracy in the Middle East. They're the only civilizational state that reflects that of the West. And this is something that has been crushed. And inshallah, this is something we should all continue exposing. Doesn't matter if you're Muslim or non-Muslim, so long as you're on the side of humanity and justice, especially if you're in the media space, I would say it is an obligation. It is a moral obligation for us to continue exposing this in the language that is used. Why do Palestinians just die? But Israeli soldiers are killed, are not killed. Exactly.
Yes, or butchered, yes.
Yeah, and who kills them?
Yes.
Why don't you mention who kills them? Who is starving them? Even these basic omissions have now become so apparent that you just can't fool people anymore.
And that's the thing, Dilly, and this is the reason why alternative media is necessary, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Because here's my thing over here, right? When you look at, I mean, another podcast I've started to follow, Judge Napolitano, who was a congressman in the United States Senate. He started a podcast where he actually toes an anti-Israeli narrative. I was shocked when I saw it. But it's starting to happen. Even those who are not Muslim are starting to have podcasts, like Aaron Mate, for example, who is a Jew, whose family were Holocaust survivors. And I'm thinking to myself, even the non-Muslims are starting to see through Israel and what it is.
Whether you speak about Candice Owens, Adam Smith, Dan Bilzerian, Joe Rogan, even John McCain's widow came out.
Yes, yeah.
You know things are bad.
And John McCain was an ardent supporter of Israel.
Ardent, hawkish supporter of Israel. If his widow's coming out and condemning Israel, you can kind of grasp how bad the situation's got. So we need to just keep this momentum up and not forget and lose focus that whilst we're doing all of this, thousands of our brothers and sisters in Islam and in humanity are being slaughtered at a level which, quite frankly, we cannot fathom. I am exhausted from just watching and consuming these videos. I have not seen a meal or my child in the same way since October the 7th. And I think that's the same for everyone. How many babies do you want to see burnt? Do you remember the 40 beheaded baby story?
And the lies that was there.
And the lies that was there. Not a single baby was killed.
Exactly.
And I posited this to Piers Morgan when I debated him. I said to him, name me one child. Name me one child that was beheaded, and I will sit here and I'll mourn and condemn with you. He failed to mention it.
Dilly, I have to stop you there because we have to go to a break, unfortunately. After that, talking of Piers Morgan, we're going to go to the United Kingdom. Is its government honest in wanting to cut ties with Israel? I continue that conversation after the break. Welcome back. Should we believe the United Kingdom in its plans to cut ties with Israel? That was announced last week by David Lammy. Even its Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, came out and said talks are ongoing for that to happen. And that's the reason why Dilly is here also as part of the conversation. Dilly, it's very difficult to take the United Kingdom seriously, isn't it? Given it was one of its senior officials in Lord Balfour that has created the genocide, not just in Gaza, but across Palestine. And it's very difficult to see through any supposed genuine rhetoric that they want us to believe that what we heard last week is actually going to happen.
I don't think it's going to happen. Israel is the illegitimate child of Britain, and those ties cannot be broken.
The United States may have a different.
Yeah, they might. They were the foster carer that came after.
Yes, yeah.
But to begin with, it was the founding father. It set out the political map for the formation of the Zionist entity. So I just don't believe that that's going to happen in any meaningful way. What we're seeing now in the UK, and what appears to be a pivot or a shift in rhetoric and policy, is that what Israel has been doing for the last 19 months has simply become indefensible. It's hard to defend what they're doing now. Because why are we seeing this now 19 months later? How many children did you have to see to be killed and burnt? How many women did you have to see be burnt alive? How many innocent men and elderly did you have to see, decimated in their buildings? How many schools, hospitals, mosques, UN buildings, UN schools? How many journalists and medical staff did it take for you to now change your rhetoric to indicate some kind of shift in policy? Me personally, I do not believe there would be any kind of meaningful pivot or shift in policy from the Britain, simply because the relations are too deep. They are intertwined. Lest we forget that Israel has in many cases, been described as the last front of Western civilization in the Middle East. It is seen as a colonial outpost of the West, primarily America. It is there to keep the Arabs and the Muslims busy. It is there to ensure that there isn't any meaningful liberation of Palestine and Al-Aqsa. So, no, I do not believe that there's going to be any kind of meaningful policy change. What we're seeing now is rhetoric. What we're seeing is now that they've identified that the things that Israel is doing is simply cannot be defended anymore. The public opinion is now going significantly against Israel, even amongst those who would have traditionally been sympathetic or sat on the fence. If we want to see any kind of meaningful change, and I've said this in many public platforms, stop the arms.
But they're not going to, because there's money coming there.
There you go. Arrest returning IDF soldiers with dual nationals. I'll say the same thing to the ANC government here. Even though they have, proudly led and honorably and commendably led the ICJ case. But we want to see prosecutions of returning IDF soldiers. Sure. Now, I know you guys may not have as many as in the UK. We've got hundreds, if not more than 1,000, of British dual nationals going out to Israel, committing war crimes, participating in a plausible genocide, some of them recording it on TikTok, and then coming back. We want to see them arrested. We want to see them investigated. And if found guilty, we want to see them prosecuted. That's when we'll start taking them seriously. When we start seeing an arms embargo, a complete arms embargo, then we'll start taking things seriously. For now, this is just rhetoric for us.
And that's the thing, because it's hard to look at them and say, well, they're really going to go ahead and make these arrests. Because even looking at Prime Minister Keir Starmer, when he first came out, well, he said, I'm an ardent supporter of Israel.
Yeah.
Like many other British Prime Ministers have done before.
Yep.
And once you reveal your true self at the start, it's hard for everyone to believe that. But the public doesn't see it that way. You've seen protests across the United Kingdom. The public opinion is different to that of the members of parliament, isn't it?
Well, look, we had more than 1 million march to oppose the war in Iraq. Iraq still went ahead. We had the former chief of MI5, Baroness Manningham Buller, who's the most senior security official in the UK, who warned Tony Blair at the time, don't invade Iraq. We're going to have a blowback situation of domestic terrorism. He ignored that advice. So protesting in large numbers is something that we have to do because it's a duty for us. Sure. It doesn't necessarily mean that will translate into policy change. There's so many things we should be doing. We should be looking at boycott and divestment and sanctions. We should be looking at lobbying policies makers in terms of arms embargo. We should be protesting. We should be doing all that we can. We are not heads of state. We do not have armies. We do not have the power to cease trade deals and stuff like this. As laity, Muslim or non-Muslim, what we can do is very limited, but please exhaust all that we can because it's working. What that will translate to is a completely different conversation. We have an organization in the UK called Palestine Action.
Yes.
Quite radical. They look at direct action. They go into Elbit systems, and they'll cause damage and vandalize. And some of them have been arrested, some of them have been prosecuted. But I think that's very laudable. I think that's very praiseworthy. I think it takes a great courage to take on the Zionist entity in a very meaningful, practical way. What better way can you take on the Israeli war machine by destroying the weapons that it's going to use to kill children, women, and men who are innocent? So we all need to carry on doing what we're doing, but let's just be realistic about understanding how deeply entrenched Israel and its lobby groups are in British and American and French and German politics. They are deeply embedded, deeply entrenched. They fund politicians and parties with tens of millions of dollars and pounds and euros. Let's not forget that. But we just need to keep the pressure on. I don't think there's going to be any meaningful policy shifts from the UK. If they want to prove themselves, then stop all weapons, all weapon parts going to Israel. Arrest returning IDF soldiers. That's what we need to start seeing. Then we can start taking them seriously. And that's not even enough, by the way.
Yeah.
That's a starting point.
Yeah, exactly. But obviously what will need to happen in Israel is a complete boycott like what we had here in South Africa.
Absolutely.
And maybe then they would isolate themselves. The European Union, I want to go to them because obviously they are as complicit, given
Of course.
some of its members.
Of course.
Are as complicit in assisting Israel in committing this genocide. On Monday, I had a group of lawyers who said that they want Ursula von der Leyen arrested. They're from Gypri, which is based in Geneva, Switzerland. the European Union, they just like the United Kingdom, and it was quite ironic, within a space of a few days, they were singing the same song and tale as the United Kingdom government. The European Union themselves now, how much of accountability are they going to need to be held to, given its role in this Gaza genocide? And their actions now wanting to say, well, we need to go ahead and sanction Israel. Surely that in itself is not just going to be forgotten by people who see the EU as a direct complicit with Israel.
Absolutely. And one of the leading nations within the EU has obviously been Germany,
Yes.
which is even more shocking given that it's past with the Holocaust and Nazi Germany and so forth. I'll posit it back to you and to the viewers to consider, who holds these people to account?
Sure.
Who will hold the EU to account? Who will hold these Western governments that have been enabling, complicit, arming, funding? And that's the question that I posit to Naledi Pandor, who I also interviewed. And I said to her, who holds them to account? Because one of the things that's happening is that people have lost hope in a law, in international law, in a law-based system that governs the world.
Sorry, and I'm going to stop you there, because the ICJ issued January 2024 last year, July 2024 last year.
And the ICC arrest warrants as well.
Arrest warrants also, and Israel looks at it and says, "Oh, we'll just spit you in the face, because what the hell is international law?"
And then Hungary pulls out of the ICC
Exactly.
So we've seen that when it comes to international law, it applies to some and doesn't apply to others. It can be enforced on some and it can't be enforced on others. Whilst I'm by no means any type of defender for Russia and its policies, but we saw how Russia was dealt with when it invaded Ukraine, the language, the policies, how certain assets were frozen pretty much instantaneously, and how that same policy doesn't apply to Israel. There is a clear double standard in the way that international law applies to certain nations, how it's implemented and enforced on certain nations. I want to ask everyone watching this program and who's participating in all these type of debates is that we need to now start talking who holds these entities to account. Because ultimately, after World War II, Britain, France, Russia, America, and China ultimately are the policemen of the world, right? The 5 permanent security members of UN. Then we have NATO, we have EU, we have all these international bodies. Who holds them to account? This is what Global South and the Muslim majority world need to start thinking about. Now, I know that might be difficult considering how how subservient some of the Arab Muslim countries are.
I think that's one of the things also. It's difficult to say how the Arab world is going to come and save the entire Global South.
They won't. Let me give you an example, right? Yeah. When you look at AIPAC, the main Israeli lobby in America, and look at how much money they buy congressmen and senators with, 10 million, 5 million, 100,000, 500,000, right? That is what we call in England fish and chip change.
Yeah.
Saudi committed $600 billion. The UAE committed $1.2 trillion over the course of 10 years. Qatar, $1.4 trillion, sent a palace on a plane, on a Boeing. That's like nearly $3 trillion. Yet, we couldn't get a ceasefire. Yet, the Arab nation could not get a single bottle of water through to Gaza. Where is this money going? What is the end objective of this money? Because there's this now new emerging argument that Trump is an isolationist. He wants the Arab world to just crack on with things. Now it's all about industry and technology and investments. This is the new world order that's now forming. I'm not sure if you've heard this argument, right? That's no.
I watched it during the Middle East tour. Yes.
Exactly. It's no longer about American interventionism. Okay, fine. Then use your money for leverage. If the Israeli lobby can do it with $50 million, how is it with $3 trillion that the Arabs can't manage to get a concrete plan for a ceasefire and get aid into Gaza? So these are serious discussions that we need to have internally as an ummah and just basically position ourselves and learn from previous mistakes. That $3 trillion, subhanAllah, can be used and leveraged for so many things, right? But what a travesty. How sad is it that this great nation, the Ummah, and the Arab people who have always prided themselves in honor and chivalry and bravery and courage, after giving $3 trillion, you still cannot get a bottle of water in any meaningful way or any ceasefire deal. This is a shame. So it's on the Arab world and the Ummah to have these internal discussions to basically learn how to leverage and lobby properly.
Yeah. I have to stop you there because we have
Sure.
to go for a break, unfortunately. We wrap up the conversation after this. Dilly has had a number of interviews with far-right politicians in Europe. How is Islam going to counter that? Do stay tuned. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm wrapping up my conversation with Dilly Hussein. Dilly, you've had a number of encounters with far-right politicians in Europe. 100 years ago, of course, we saw the rise of nationalism, whether it was in Italy, Spain, Germany, of course, most notably in Germany with the Nazi Party. We're not there yet, are we?
We're not there yet, but there are certainly worrying signs that Europe is certainly shifting towards a populist right. We see this with the AfD in Germany. We saw this with the National Front in France. We see this with Geert Wilders in Netherlands. We're seeing it with the rise of Reform UK, who made huge gains in the local council elections and find themselves either neck on neck or in some polls ahead of the ruling Labour Party in the UK. And the reason for this are many. I think there's been a genuine kind of lost in hope amongst the white population in Europe towards liberal policies and liberal parties, who are equally as violent as their counterparts on the right, who are equally as nefarious in the way that they create economic and fiscal policies that actually go against the working class and the poor. However, that said, I've had various engagements with very prominent right-wing or far-right figures. Jada Franson, who was the former deputy leader of Britain First, Nick Griffin, who was the former leader of the British Nationalist Party, Mark Collett, the founder of Patriotic Alternative. You can even kind of put Errol Musk there if you wish.
Yes.
But I'm engaging with those who are on the right because what I've seen from them is that they have some genuine concerns, but their anger is misplaced. If your issue is mass immigration, why don't you ask why is there a high number of immigration in the first place?
Exactly.
Have you looked at where the people are coming from? Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, just these three countries alone, war and sanctions,
Yes.
right? How about stop creating wars? How about stop invading countries? How about stop selling weapons to despotic regimes that create refugees in the first place? And then perhaps we can have a more meaningful conversation about mass immigration, number one. Number two, why is immigration being incentivized? Why is immigration being incentivized? Because there's a labor shortage. And the reason why there's a labor shortage is because there is an issue of white Europeans not having enough children. So they have an aging population and they're not having enough children. And not having enough children, by the way, is a problem across the world. Yeah, people are increasingly having less babies and there is a depopulation concern. Elon Musk talks about it all the time. But comparatively, Muslims and people of color and immigrant communities are having nearly twice or even in some cases 3 times more children than their white counterparts.
Sure.
Why are white Europeans and Westerners not having enough children? Because you're not having children, you're going to continue this cycle of an aging population where there's always going to be a labor shortage. You need the labor market to be filled in, whether it's low skill or high skill, wherever it may be, because you need taxation, and taxation makes the country run.
Sure.
I know this is a very simplified depiction of the situation, but that is what it is. Their main frustration are the following: mass immigration, loss of identity, the domination of Islam is taking over. These are all similar talking points that you'll find amongst all the right-wing groups. Once you sit them down and you ask them objectively to have a fact-based conversation that if your issue is mass immigration, let's look at the contributions of the said immigrant communities to the said given economies. You know, if all immigrants left the UK tomorrow, the economy would collapse. If all non-white people, even those who were born in the UK, were to just up and leave in a mass exodus, Britain would collapse. In fact, most European countries would collapse. Germany benefited significantly from the Syrian refugees that came to their countries. And that's one of the things which liberal parties failed to articulate, because they would, on the one hand, have this open border policy, if it can be described as such, because they know there is fiscal advantages to having low-skilled labor because there's a labor shortage, but they would not articulate to the masses why it's needed. The contribution of immigrant communities, whether they are born immigrant communities like my forefathers who came in 1960s after World War II, or the new immigrant communities that are coming, either escaping war war and destabilization. That's not to say there's nothing wrong with having tighter policies, border policies. Everyone wants safer borders. No one wants criminals coming into their countries.
Sure, of course.
We can all agree on that.
Yeah, but not to the extent of the way Donald Trump makes it.
Exactly.
Who has the same rhetoric of the right. Yeah.
Absolutely, where you're just picking up innocent people for having political views, right? He's now shipping people back over and deporting people for just espousing views against Israel, yet allowing Boer farmers to come over to the US. So, what we look, even many people who voted for Brexit in the UK, when they were interviewed, they thought it was to do with Muslim immigration.
Yes, I remember that.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine?
And Boris Johnson looked very confused.
Very confused. They thought it was about keeping the Turks out. The Turks were never part of the EU. So what you have found is that dog whistle politics, propaganda, appealing to the lowest denominator of people who, for whatever reason, aren't the most intelligent or well-read. You are convincing these people that the problem are immigrants. The problem are Muslims. The problem are X, Y, and Z. We've seen this rhetoric play over in Europe in World War II. We see where that can lead, and we need to prevent that. So what I would advise anyone who engages with people that have these type of views is to first engage with them respectfully, is to then engage with them based on facts. And you'll find that when you start engaging those on the right on facts, their arguments collapse. Look, their concerns are the same as anyone else. They want access to employment. They want access to housing. They want opportunities that everyone else wants. But you then need to ask, rechannel your frustrations towards the establishment. Because ultimately it is capitalist corporations who influence policies that gain from all of this. They gain from Brexit, they gain from immigration. So these are the questions that we need to be positing.
Dilly, Islam. Both your forefathers, my forefathers, of course, from Southeast Asia, and they brought Islam with them. Of course, Islam was long here before my grandparents, both from my mum and my dad's side. So the same can be said about yours also, because Islam has quite a rich history within the United Kingdom, as it was here in South Africa. Islam, how important was Islam then in dealing with far-right politicians, especially in South Africa, when they were dealing with the British monarchy, colonialism, and then of course the National Party, as opposed to now, given the rise of the far right within Europe?
Now, obviously, whether it's those from the Indian subcontinent who are in South Africa or Uganda, or those in Britain, we were ultimately there as a result of British colonialism, right? Of course, what I would say is that Islam, alhamdulillah, is a holistic, comprehensive worldview. It has the answers to everything, the private and the public. And it actually has a very revolutionary element of it. And that is standing for justice and opposing oppression. Now, in the Indian subcontinent, we know that there was resistance to the British Empire. We know there was the 1857 mutiny, and there were many attempts at fighting the British colonizers. I don't want to comment too deeply on the role of Islam and Muslims in the South African context. I know that there were many involved in it, most famously the great Qatadra. May Allah Qatrada, may Allah have mercy on him. Ameen.
Inshallah, ameen.
But what I would say is this: we are not doing enough. We are not doing enough in terms of outreach. We're not doing enough in terms of influence in the way we do our activism, in the way that we do our lobbying. I believe what's happened is that Muslim diaspora communities, whether it's the much older community here in South Africa or the more newer communities in Europe, it's easy to just accept and take on what appears to be left-leaning rhetoric and policy, which is good because socialists and leftists, we find comfort in those spaces because there are overlaps and agreements on certain issues. But Muslims need to carve out their own narrative. We need to carve out our own political destiny. And Islam has that. Its text, the Quran and Sunnah, the scholarly works of our ulama, has it in abundance to allow us to shape robust strategies where Islam plays a leading role in not just opposing the far right or neoliberal policies, but to just oppose injustice and oppression. And I'll end on this. The Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked by one of the companions, what is the best form of jihad? One would expect that maybe the answer would be military or physical. No, the Prophet ﷺ said that the best type of jihad is a word of truth to a tyrannical ruler. In another narration, Prophet ﷺ said that if you see an evil, change it with your hands. If you cannot, speak out against it. And the worst form of iman is to change it from within. Allah says in the Quran, be firm on justice strive for justice, even if it's against yourself. So the consistent theme of justice and opposing oppression is so consistent in the Quran and Sunnah that it is sufficient for us to create movements where we are leading the narratives with our own language and our own discourse while seeking alliances without making major compromises. Islam has a huge role, not just for the diaspora communities, but for all of humanity.
Dilly, unfortunately, I wish we had more time to continue this conversation, but unfortunately, it has to end. Absolute pleasure having you on. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
That's Dilly Hussein, who's my special guest for today's edition of News in Focus. From myself, Fahraaz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.